So hi, everybody. Now you're all thinking I must be as old as Methuselah, really, after 30 years. Wait till you're old enough to say that you've worked in the same field for over 30 years. But the joy of that is that indeed, if you do like working with people, I've had the chance to work with people in 3 provinces. And one of the things that I've learned is that there appears to be an increase in the rate with which our children suffer from anxiety. So I'm not surprised in a way to see so many people out here tonight, because anxiety is becoming a huge problem for our kids, and kids very, very young in age. So what I want to do tonight is give you a little bit of information about what anxiety is, and the difference between being a worrywart and being a person with an anxiety problem. And then focus a fair bit on some of the coping strategies that you can work on as parents with your kids, and that you can work on for yourselves, since we often see that anxious parents have anxious kids. So you'll find that if you're anxious, you'll benefit yourself as you work on the strategies. So if we look at why it's important to think about helping our kids with their anxiety, what we do know is that anxious thoughts lead to low self-esteem, because what they tend to do is to include a tremendous amount of negativity about the self and about what could happen in the world. So if you're worried all the time that something is going to be a disaster and that you're not going to be able to handle it, what we see is that kids start to feel pretty lousy about themselves. We also see that they tend to start really avoiding any situation that might trigger their anxiety. So that's okay if it's a situation that comes along once in a blue moon and isn't really important developmentally. But as you guys all know, if it becomes something that's really essential for that child to do, whether it's going to school or if it's going to birthday parties or going and trying out for sports, all the things that you want your child to have fun doing and to learn from doing, if their anxiety is getting in the way, then we need to be sure that we teach them some coping strategies to reduce that. What we do know is that school phobia springs from severe anxiety. So what we see is that tendency for the anxious child, to want to avoid the thing that's making them really fearful, and over time they come up with a lot of really ingenious reasons why going to school isn't a good idea, and we end up with a situation where the young person is not going to school regularly. Without tools for that child or adolescent to figure out how to manage their anxiety, they can end up in situations that we see where kids have been out of school for entire school years, with their anxiety response getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So what we know is there's a lot of us anxious people in the world, so about 10% of the population is anxious. That always makes me feel better because I'm an anxious person, so I've got company. What we know is that we can detect the proclivity to become anxious as early as 21 months of age, because kids really vary in terms of their reactivity, how they respond to changes, to stranger situations. Kids as young as 21 months old can be really separated out amongst themselves in terms of how readily they calm. And what we see is there's a real correlation between being that really reactive, easily agitated, hard to soothe baby, and somebody who is going to be anxious in their childhood and adolescence. However, only 2 or 3% of the 10% of anxious individuals end up with something that you'd call an anxiety disorder. So it isn't as though everybody in that 10% is having anxiety that's getting in the way of their ability to lead their lives. But 2 to 3% of the population is a fair number of people. So it's really important for us as parents, and that's why it's encouraging to see all of you guys out tonight, to really look at working with our anxious and sensitive kids, no matter their age, to help them to learn how to manage that temperament issue. Sometimes it's nice for kids to just know that it's kind of normal to be anxious. It isn't like you're a crazy person, even though you can feel pretty crazy when you're in the midst of a real attack of anxiety. So the 2% are those kids that are stopped in their tracks, and that means they're not doing the things they need to do. So they're not leaving. They can't separate from mom and dad. They're worried something awful is going to happen if they do that. They're not doing sleepovers. They're not going to parties in case something comes up at the party that wasn't predictable and they didn't know how they'd cope with it. They're struggling with the substitute teacher at school, those sorts of things. So they begin to not go and not participate. On the mild end, anxiety can be troubling for people, and parents will talk about knowing one child in the family is a bit more sensitive than the other, but it doesn't get in the way. But what's interesting about that fact is the same strategies that you would use to help just a sensitive child in your family can help that super anxious child in your family. So the task is to pick it up pretty quickly, that it's a necessary thing, and get on the ball with it right away, and you can really make a big difference. So all of these early slides that I'm going to present are things that in language that your young person could understand, you could be presenting to them too. So I'm teaching you about what the anxiety response is in the person's body, but it's helpful for kids to understand that too. I don't know, and I won't ask for a show of hands, if anyone else in the audience has had an overwhelming anxiety response, and I have in my youth. And what ends up happening then is that you really do feel like you're going bonkers. So it's very helpful for kids to understand that it's a normal biological process that they can manage. So what we see is that there's that fight-flight reaction, which all of us are familiar with, and that's the adrenaline rush. So what we see is there's a response, there's a signal that triggers a danger response. Adrenaline floods your system and you have all of those symptoms. What we see with anxious people is that adrenaline rush happens in reaction to a broad range of things that it's not needed for. So it's almost like you're having a body reaction that's totally out of proportion for the stimulus that you're seeing, the situation, and it's higher intensity and it lasts longer. So that's the biological component that distinguishes the highly anxious from the less anxious. Everybody has a fight-flight reaction. I don't know if you've ever had a real scary thing happen, right? I'm sure probably all of us can think of something. And it's a realistic trigger, like, you know, if you're terrified of dogs and you come around the corner and there's a huge big dog coming at you and it's snarling, you're going to have that adrenaline rush. And that's normal because it's going to make you be able to cope more on the ball, more alertly with that situation. What we see is that if the person's level of anxiety is too high, they're going to respond with an adrenaline rush in situations that don't warrant it. So, you know, there's going to be a substitute teacher at school, I can't go because I'm in such a terrible state, I can't cope with it. So I talk with kids in my practice, kind of like an anxiety 101. So that's why I've labeled it that way. And I cover really all the things we've talked about so far in the presentation, that it can be adaptive. It's okay sometimes to be fearful, that you know, your body is alerting you and getting you ready to respond, but that if you tend to be anxious, you might want to question whether or not this is a situation that really warrants that level of adrenaline rush. And okay, so like, how can I calm myself down? And that's the big trick. So we've talked about the excessiveness of response is a sign. If you're trying to figure out whether your child has an anxiety problem, one thing is to think, okay, is it a really big response? Is it bigger than what you would consider to be what you see your friends' kids, the other siblings in the family, that kind of thing. But then you're also looking to see whether or not it's developmentally appropriate. And what I mean by that is it normal for a child of that age to be fearful of that sort of situation? So we know that there's an age at which kids make strange, right? So it's perfectly normal for that infant to respond with anxiety and fear when they're placed in the arms of a stranger. However, if you have an 8 or a 9-year-old who can't go to grandma's to sleep over because they're going to be too scared to sleep there, and unless grandma's an evil grandma, the rest of you are thinking that doesn't make sense, then you know you've got somebody that's struggling, right? That there's a level of anxiety that's out of control. So one of the things that we know is that in treatment of anxiety disorders, no matter the age of the person, we use an approach that's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and probably you've all heard of that. And it's really straightforwardly that we've come to know over time that anxiety affects people in 3 different ways, and that's the triangle. And the parts of the triangle interact with one another. So we know that there are specific kinds of thoughts that are associated with being an anxious person. So up here I've given an example. What if something bad happens to mom while I'm away at school? That's a common one for kids that are struggling with separation anxiety. But it could also be if I go to school, I might get really anxious. It makes me feel sick to my stomach. I'll throw up. Everybody will make fun of me. Everybody will stand and stare at me. I can't go to school. So it's that kind of catastrophizing thinking. It's all or none thinking. If one bad thing happens, it's always going to happen, and it'll happen in every situation. So those kinds of thoughts help to build anxiety in the individual. So if you think about it in your own life, it's usually helpful if you kind of use a personal example when you're before you try to teach something to your child. So think of a situation where you know that what you say to yourself in your head has an impact on how you're feeling and then how you respond. There are two really straightforward examples when you're learning this concept. One is if you're home alone at night and it's dark and you've gone to bed and you hear thump and rattle. If you think somebody is breaking into your house, then you're going to respond with that adrenaline rush, right? Fear, flight. If you think, oh, the furnace is so loud and we've got to drain the water out of the radiators, which is what I tell myself, I live in an old house, then you're not going to respond with terror, right? You're going to respond by thinking, oh, I've got to nag my husband the next day if you're me, but I'm not going to be terrified, right? The other example would be when you're driving and you're stuck behind a slow person. So you're late for work, you got to get there, your child made you late for work because they didn't want to go to school because they're anxious, and you're driving along, and if you say to yourself, I shouldn't have to put up with this, and yada, 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 and you are angry and thinking angry thoughts in your head, then you're going to respond maybe by tailgating, maybe by wanting to honk the horn, pass on the wrong side, do all sorts of behaviors, right, that relate to that anger response. So the same thing operates with anxiety. Anxiety also leads to anxious feelings, and there's a slide where I'll list some of the things, but I'm sure you can think about from your own perspective or that of your child's where all in the body anxiety shows up. But we certainly know it causes stomach issues and lightheadedness and heart racing and breathing quickly and so on. And then as part of those thoughts and feelings, it leads to particular kinds of anxious behaviors. So we see that people do things in response to their anxiety, and it tends to fall into some main categories: avoidance, escape, seek reassurance. So that's what we hear from parents, and that's what we see from the kids that we work with at Maryvale. People try really hard to not go to a place that makes them feel really uncomfortable. So there's the avoidance motivation. And once they're in it, they want to get the heck out of it as fast as they can. The example of this would be, think how much relief you have when you know you have to go to the endodontist or something, and it's been booked and you've been increasingly horrified by the prospect, and you get to that morning and you're thinking, I can't stand it, I'm terrified, it'll be awful. And then they phone and say, oh, I'm very sorry, we've had to cancel. Well, if you're me, you never rebook. That would be the response. But that's that kind of escape thing, right? And then seeking reassurance is very common for anxious people and can get really on the nerves of parents, and I never blame them, because it's like over and over and over and over, I'm okay, you'll be okay, they're okay, they don't hate me. It's that kind of thing. Or I'll be all right tomorrow. Constant reassurance, because it helps just a little bit to lower that anxiety. So here's some of the physical signs, and you can think about your own experience or that of your child, but it's a lot of very uncomfortable physical symptoms, which if the child doesn't understand that it's normal and then they're not going to die, you can feel like you're going to die. You know, your heart's racing, you can't breathe properly, you feel lightheaded when you stand up, your muscles feel funny, you might have numbness or tingling in your hands. There's a lot of things that happen when you're really anxious. So you can sort of sympathize that people think I'll do anything in my power to get the heck out of this situation. So if we think about particulars, I just came up with some common ones that we hear from kids and from teenagers. It's oftentimes themes in anxiety. So it might be around social anxiety, where kids are going to make fun of them or laugh at them, or they don't have anybody that's their friend, that kind of thing. Worry that people are mad at them when there's really no evidence that they are, that kind of focus. And then sometimes it's around things like tests and academic performance, and it can get fixated there. I love this cartoon, and it's hard to read, and I kept it because it's so personal for me. I am blindly terrified of flying, to the point where, like, my husband says if he can survive me in an airport before we get on the plane, it's a testimony to 40 years of marriage. Because I'm not rational. Like, I know I'm not being rational in the airport, but I do it anyways, and he's just looking at me like, but anyway, it's the co-pilot, and he's saying to Frank, the pilot, "The fuel light's on, Frank. We're all going to die. We're all going to die." And then there's a pause, and he says, "Oh, wait, my mistake. That's the intercom light." So it's that notion, right, of jumping the gun with your anxiety. Behaviors, and we've talked a little bit about that. So the avoidant behaviors are things like, we have teenagers that we work with who can go to school, but they can only stay in the guidance office. So they have to avoid everywhere else in the school. And so their work can only get done in the guidance office, and that obviously compromises what you can learn. Or kids that will not turn in their homework, even though they've done it, because they're worried about it not being perfect. It isn't going to be correct. I can't turn it in. So it can permeate so much of a child's life that you can see why it becomes this big obstacle. So in school, teachers talk to us about seeing not only the school avoidance, but also seeing refusal to do changes in routine if they're younger kids, not wanting to go on school outings or special events, they won't want to come to school if they have to do a presentation. They don't want to contend with a new teacher, that sort of thing. One of the things that's important for parents of kids that are anxious to realize is, I think a lot of the community that maybe isn't dealing with severe anxiety thinks about anxiety as being those kind of quiet, worry-warty kids, and that they would be easy to handle because they're just worriers, right? Well, what we do know is if you're severely anxious, you're not so easy to handle because what we see is a lot of meltdown behavior because you feel so uncomfortable, and kids will have wild meltdowns, temper tantrums, desperation. I always think that's kind of what it is. It's motivated by desperation, trying to avoid that scary thing that's bothering them. So in terms of teaching your child some messages, important to teach them about the fact that being anxious isn't going to kill you, that the racing heart isn't going to kill them. You need to make sure that you try and talk about your own experiences of anxiety, but not as I have done, talking about how I'm irrational, my husband wants to kill me, but more in terms of talking about things that make you anxious and how you manage your anxiety. So by doing that, you're normalizing, right? You're saying, we tend to be a bit anxious in our family, and here's what I've learned to do because I'm a lot older than you. You don't ever want to, and I mean this is a parenting apple pie, I guess, but you try really hard not to discount the feeling. And it can get hard to do when you're dealing with a really difficult, ongoing problem with anxiety. But you don't want to say things like, you shouldn't feel that way, don't be silly, this is nothing, that kind of stuff. So you can validate how the child feels and then move on to how are we going to cope with it without having to say it's silly and you're out of proportion. Because what ends up happening, if someone says you're being silly, it's like when people try to rationalize flight phobia for me. I think to myself, what do you know, right? People die on airplanes, and I don't trust them. And in not trusting them, it makes my anxiety worse. So it's important to remember that when you're working with your child. So, some key things, and I'll show you the worry hill shortly. It's really important to talk to your child early on about how much they need to not avoid the thing that's making them anxious. And I'll show you how we teach that to kids. But you also have to say to them that facing a fear can be done in steps. So you don't need to tackle the most scariest thing about your fear all in one fell swoop without working your way up to it. So, for example, if you were me and you're terrified of flying, nobody's going to get me as my first move to get into a helicopter and go over the Grand Canyon, because I think I probably would have to be hospitalized. But along the way, you can work out ways to break down that fear into manageable steps. So there's a woman who does a lot of work with kids, and she's kind of the expert in working with anxious children. Her name's Aureen Wagner, and she's been up in town and done some training with us. She talks about riding the worry hill. And she came up with that because it was helpful for little kids. And so she says, you got to learn to ride the worry hill. So if you look at this peaked curve, she talks about how as you approach the situation that you're most fearful of, your anxiety climbs. So it's going up that hill, it's increasing in intensity. And she talks about exposure because you're exposing yourself to things leading up to that most scary thing. If at the very top of your anxiety you run away, you avoid, then what happens is you have immediate reward because it's like that dental thing, right? Phew. You just get that plunge of adrenaline. It's very, very, very rewarding. But she says you fail to habituate, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is. But bottom line is you go right back around again, and the next time that trigger comes up, you've made no progress. You're in the same boat. So she teaches kids that they need to learn coping strategies so that they can stay at the top of that hill and bring themselves down it so they can coast down the hill. So that's the simple concept, and it capitalizes on the physiology of anxiety because the habituation is that your body doesn't stay that anxious indefinitely. So even though the anxious person can think it's never going to end, if you help them to learn ways of managing their anxiety, they'll learn, oh, well, it goes away. So for someone like me who's terrified of flying, the puddle jumper flights between here and Toronto are terrible for me because I go shoom to the top, and then we go back down so quickly, I never really have a chance to habituate, right? I got an hour flight that's full of terror. But if I'm flying to Vancouver, I've got enough time. I just notice my body gives up the ghost. It just calms down and I'm all right again. That's what we're doing with kids. So the first step is to help the young person figure out what's triggering the anxiety. And it could be a variety of things, but you have to help them label the feelings and figure out where it's coming from. With little kids, sometimes what we'll do is we'll have them trace their body and then mark out where their worst spots are for anxiety, because then you're going to target your coping strategies to that. If it's a racing heart or short breath or tense muscles, that kind of thing. We also try very hard to get kids to understand that they're more than the anxiety. So that's really important. In the same way, if you had a little child that was prone to temper tantrums, you don't want the teacher saying, you know, your child's a bad boy. You don't want grandma saying that, auntie saying that. That's another personal thing for me. What you want to do is figure out this is a person with a temper, right? And a person with a temper can learn to manage their temper, and they're a whole lot more than the temper. They might be really funny, they might be really smart, they might be really kind and helpful to other people. They're not just their temper. So the same thing applies with anxiety. You can't think of yourself as only anxiety or you'd never do anything, right? So sometimes if they name the anxiety, we'll get little kids to give it a name. And then what you're doing is you're joining with your child to fight back and shrink this anxiety. And sometimes little kids will draw pictures of the anxiety. Important that you encourage them not to call the anxiety a big scary name, even though it feels like a big scary feeling. But you don't want to be trying to fight, I don't know, Godzilla or something. You want him to have a goofy name because it's easier to target that goofy thing. The message is, I know it's really scary, but I believe you can do it, and I'm on your side, and I'm going to help, right? So the helping involves facing fears, which is the ugly part, from the point of view of the anxious person. So you have to be attuned to helping them figure out where the thoughts are coming from and what the triggers are. Then you have to help them to really work on not avoiding it. And this is the real trap for many of us as parents, because you really want your child to feel comfortable. And you can start thinking, well, why do they have to go to that thing? You know, it's not the end of the world if they don't go to that party or they don't go to that game or they don't do X or Y. But if you have an anxious child, each one of those, oh, okay, you don't have to's, can climb up. It builds that anxiety stronger and stronger. So what you can do sometimes is to say, you know, how would you help a friend that had this fear? And get them to come with you on that journey and figure out what advice they'd give their friend to tackle the problem. So I give the swimming pool example. So they need to have a goal of their own. So that's like everything when we're parenting. We always know what our kids should be doing, but the should word is never very effective. So you have to try and figure out with them, what is the anxiety most getting in the way of for them? And what is their goal around that anxiety? And it is important to remember that nobody likes being anxious. So this isn't a behavior problem of, I'm just doing this to drive you guys crazy kind of situation. So you try and get them to come up with something that has meaning to them. And I've given a couple of examples, getting to school every morning, being able to sleep on their own through the night, that sort of thing, maybe going to a birthday party, that sort of thing. And then you help them to come up with steps towards that goal. Because remember, it's got to be baby steps. You're not going to leap right into the deep end if you don't know how to swim. No giant leaps. And if you're working up this progress to the ultimate goal and the child hits a dead end and you have a meltdown, don't think about it as being, they're just being stubborn and difficult. You think to yourself, and we do that as therapists, the step was too big. So if you visualize a ladder, I've left out 3 steps and I'm trying to get the person to step up too high. So you break it down and make it smaller. All right, here. So this is a fear thermometer. It's another Maureen Wagner tool. Many of these are on her web page online, so you can look her up. And really, its purpose is to teach the young person that not all anxiety is as severe as the rest. So they're learning to rate how anxious they feel. That has the purpose of helping you to set those goals, because you're trying to set less anxiety-provoking first goals, right? But it also gives the young person a bit of a sense of control, because if you think everything is equally as bad, then you're just almost like in a war zone. You don't want to do anything. If you realize I can do this and it's about a 4, but if I do that, it's about a 7, it gives you a sense that there are differences in situations and I can start moving my way through them. One of the key things is to help anxious children replace those worrying, anxious thoughts with some realistic thoughts, because we know thoughts really influence level of anxiety. So what we do know is that us worriers, anxious people, are really good at worrying. So it means that really almost all the time there is a worry running in the back of their heads. And we know is that worriers, alias the anxious, are exceptionally good at remembering bad things. So if something bad happened to somebody, even peripheral to them in a situation, they will remember the details. And whereas a more calm-natured individual who doesn't deal with anxiety very much would probably not have even tuned into those things, and certainly a month later are not going to remember it. So I have 2 highly anxious children with slightly differing focuses for their anxiety. But I'm telling you, our dinner table discussions, it was like work trying to get, okay, we each of us had one positive experience today. We're going to focus on the positive, because everybody could talk about this happened and it could have been that, and it was just awful. So that's really important, is to help people to realize that you got to figure out other thoughts to think to substitute for those worries. So that's where we talk about coping self-talk. And this is another strategy you can work on with your child. So coping self-talk is used to help yourself calm down, and we all do it. If you think about it, my mother's theme, and I do it now, turning into her, is "this too shall pass," is what Mom used to say to me. I think I probably drove her totally bonkers as an anxious child who didn't go to school for tons of time and all sorts of stuff. But she'd say to me, "Oh, Janet, this too shall pass." It's that kind of thing of realizing it isn't so bad, I can withstand it, I can tolerate this, it's going to end. There are all sorts of versions of those kinds of thoughts. So if a child is thinking, I'm going to fail, and I can't go to school because I'm going to fail, there are strategies that they can use to think different thoughts. So what evidence do I have to think I'm going to fail? Did I study? I studied. I must know some information. I guess I'm not going to fail. So you have to have the patience to try and work through that with them and help them to practice those thoughts. They are not going to be completely convinced it's going to work at the beginning. So the other thing you have to do is reward, 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 because it can feel to an anxious person like you're trying to stop an elephant with a BB gun. It just doesn't feel like it's going to be strong enough. And they have to practice. So if we think of the example, it would be my anxious thoughts are I'm going to fail that test today for sure. That's going to make me scared, worried, and tense. And I'm going to avoid school, or I'm going to blow up and be really angry. Realistic thoughts would be I studied, I know lots of information. It's just a test. I've done well on other tests. That's going to make it more likely that I might feel calm, I might be more energetic and kind of think maybe I'll do well, right, and have energy to do it. And the coping behavior is likely to be go to school, focus on the test and doing my best. Another strategy to work on with your kids, and this has kind of come out of the mindfulness literature. I don't know if you're familiar with mindfulness, but many of us are, and it has to do with recognizing that a thought is just a thought. For many of us, the early parts of treatment are really recognizing that a thought is just a thought, because they run in your head all the time. And if you're a small child, it's very hard to recognize that that's just a thought. It's not the reality of the situation, right? So it's trying to sort of recognize that if a negative thought pops into your brain, you don't have to elaborate on it. So that's back to that whole worrying thing with the anxious, right? I can think, oh, what if Tracy doesn't have the PowerPoint on the computer? And I did think that today, but I just was able to think, okay, it's just, I'm not going to grab it. So I try to visualize not grabbing it. When I start to grab it, it's when I start thinking, and then it'll be a disaster, and this is a big crowd, last night was a small, like I could just get yourself in a frenzy, right? And that's what kids do as well around their own anxieties. So it's trying to model for them that, oh, I drove home in the car today and I thought to myself, what a horrible day I had at work. But then I turned on the radio and I listened to a song, and now I'm home and I'm glad to be home. So it's just trying to teach that you don't have to focus on that negative thought. Some common thinking errors, I think I've alluded to them off and on through the presentation so far, is that thinking something doesn't mean it's going to come true. Not to jump to conclusions. So for my children, it was, I'm lousy at this sport, I'll be lousy at all sports, I will never be picked for a team, I'm not trying out, you can't make me. As opposed to thinking, well, I'm not very good at that, but maybe I'll be okay at that. And do I like it, right? That's the other part. Could I take some enjoyment from it? And all or none thinking. It's like, if I'm lousy at this thing, then nobody will be my friend, right? It's everything. And that, I feel like a loser sometimes, so I am a loser. So these are just particular examples of those sorts of thinking. It's really Eeyore thinking. So if we look at what's in your toolkit, what we do with little kids is we'll say, decorate a box. You've got a box, put whatever you want on the surface of that box. You can get them at the dollar store, those wooden boxes. And in them, you start to put some of the strategies that you're working on together. So some of the coping self-talk that we've talked about, you print it out, or you have pictures that remind the child of it if they're very young. You have coping cards that predict, okay, this situation is coming up, this is what I'm going to do to cope. And then we get into things like relaxation and visualization. So if you're working on relaxation, what you're tackling is that part of the body that responds to anxiety for that individual. So most people that are anxious will talk about feeling rigid with their tension associated with anxiety. And they tend to do the things that are going to make their muscles more rigid, really, and not do the relaxation. So what I suggest to parents is to practice relaxation exercises with the child, not when they're anxious, but at a time when it's just an ordinary part of your daily routine. So perhaps it's at bedtime, and you would, lie down with the child, and you've got deep muscle relaxation you're doing, and you combine it with visualizing a really safe, comfortable, pleasant place. young people are very good at visualizing, and certainly, when I was doing those things with my children, they each had their own place that they went to when they were trying to feel their most safe, most comfortable, most peaceful, and that's what we would elaborate. And you want to make it as detailed as possible. So what do you see? What do you smell? What do you feel in this place? What are the colors? You really want to enrich it, and then you're pairing it with tensing and relaxing muscles. And the reason that works is because if you hold a muscle tense and let it go, there's a warmth and an automatic response physiologically that feels good. So it kind of combines the two. You do the visualization because there will be situations, even if the person's super good at doing relaxation, that they can't do that tensing and relaxing. But if they're really good at pairing that with visualization, and if they've practiced and practiced and practiced, they can find themselves able to go to that place. So I don't know if you guys ever do that, but if you have a safe place, it can be a really good thing to do if you know you're facing an anxious situation. The other thing to do is, as you're teaching children to rate the level of intensity of the feeling, you can combine it with the strategies that they use. So it's almost like a little menu. If a feeling is only going to be a 4 out of 10 for anxiety, then maybe you take a few deep breaths and you remember a pleasant thing that happened today and you're able to tackle it. If you know you're facing a 9 on 10 anxious situation, then you have to pull out the big guns from your coping strategies. So that's the purpose for this rating thing. So reduction of stress. One of the things that I think our society has done to us as adults is really be judgmental around self-care. So there's a sense that you should just work, right? And you're running all over the place all the time, and you don't have time to look after yourself, and you're at work, and then you're home, and then everybody's everywhere. So I think we often don't do an exceptionally good job of slowing down with our children. So for me, when I try to remember to do this and think about it when I'm giving people some tips, is, I don't know about you guys, but when my children were really little, the weekend mornings we would, in the nice weather, walk up to the bakery that was close to our home. And when they were 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, we diddle-doddled our way along, right? Because they're noticing things. They're noticing the different bug they haven't seen before. Somebody's coming out their front door and they want to go say hello. The pace is slower and you're noticing positive things. So that for me was a self-care moment. Like, it slowed me down so that I wasn't thinking, I have to get to the bakery, I have to get the customer, go home because I got to wash the floor. It slowed me down. So this is the concept. It reduces stress if you can slow down. So it's helping your child to practice routines. And sometimes it's helping them to do that by defining that as important as a family routine. And this is a joke for me to say, because my son's best friend when he was a little boy, his mother was excellent at it. She was so good at it. And at the time I was clued out, and I remember thinking, well, why in the heck are you doing that? They would carve off times of the day where you couldn't visit, right? But this was their quiet time. And I would think, well, we want to visit now. Why are you doing that? But it was because she had an anxious child and she was trying to kind of build some quiet time, some reflection, and some practice self-soothing. So you can do the relaxation you've been practicing. You can, I'm going to teach you about the breathing triangle, which is really not tricky. You can do some of that guided imagery visualization. You can do simple things like, taking a bath, doing some coloring, listening to some music. It's really modeling ways to balance your life, because most of us don't balance our lives. We just run around like crazy people all the time. And the other thing we find with the anxious, they're often perfectionistic people. It can look not like that to parents because they won't even do anything. So how could they be perfectionists? But this one is, I'm learning how to relax, doctor, but I want to relax better and faster. I want to be on the cutting edge of relaxation. So that's the other thing, is to try to get your child to recognize that this isn't about doing it best fast. We've had anxious kids come in for treatment and they say, okay, I have exactly 2 months. And at the end of 2 months, I have to have this problem solved. Well, it's been a 14 or a 15-year developing issue. So here's the breathing triangle. And it's as simple as this. You relax your shoulders. You're sitting in a comfortable place or lying in a comfortable position. You're breathing in for a count of 5 slowly, and you're breathing out. So it's just counting and breathing in and out. And at the end, you rest for 5, and then you start all over again. It's a triangle. It's like square breathing. So it's just another geometric shape. But the notion is part of those shape things is it kind of gives your brain a thing to focus on. If you think about it, if you visualize as you're breathing the shape, it really helps to take your mind to a different place. And that's partly what we're trying to do. We're trying to distract the brain. So distractions, one of the things that we have to really educate people about is it's okay to distract your brain. Kids that are anxious people tend to think that everything in life is a job, and I have to do it right, and it's work, and I'm going to tackle it. And it's not okay. If I'm anxious, I have to stay focused on that till I come up with the solution. Well, if you have a young child that's worrying about nuclear holocaust, they're not going to come up with a solution. A lot of variables aren't in your control, right? So it's kind of important to know that it's all right sometimes just to take your brain and put it in a silly, neutral place. And I think that's all those adult coloring books that people are obsessed with now, right? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put our brains in a neutral place. So this is what I would suggest you think about. It's just a bunch of examples, and they're just taken from other people's ideas of people we've worked with. For me, what I do, and everybody's different. So for me, if I've had a bad day and I'm anxious and worried about something at work, usually, I will come home and read. That's what I do. I just turn my brain off reading a murder mystery, of all things. I'm not worried about them. But for some people at work, for example, they need to be with other people to distract their brains. So you need to respect what's best for your child. But, so if they need to sit and have you read to them, that's fine. But you know what their temperament is like. I alluded to focusing on the positive, and I know it sounds hokey as all get out. Maybe it doesn't to you guys. I remember as an anxious child growing up, coming home from school once at lunchtime. I look back, my poor mother, she's dead now and I can't tell her, but her saying to me, "Oh, could you please go back outside and close the door and come back in and say one positive thing?" Because I think I was worrying. I just came in, blah, 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 and it was driving a poor woman crazy. So, by the same token, I would say that in our family, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion of positives either. So what I would suggest is it's a really good idea to try and help kids to realize that positives and happy times do not need to be big adventures or exciting times. Because sometimes kids will get to a place where the only time they can identify as being happy is if they had a birthday party or they went to the fair or they did something big. And of course, we all know that life doesn't work that way, right? So we have to get better at recognizing the small things. So for example, I mark the first robin I see on the calendar, and I mark the day that I realize there are no more robins. This year I worried because there were robins in December, and I thought they were all going to turn on to frozen robins on the front of Maryvale. But it's trying, this summer my son went out in the backyard and there was a giant caterpillar who he named Glenn on the lilac bush. And Glenn the Destroyer he was. But we all took pleasure in going out and looking at that caterpillar. So it's trying to find things that will, over the course of your day, give you a moment of pleasure, and then also trying to stop long enough to notice it. Because then you're going to model that for your child, because those things really help to reduce stress. One of the things we notice when we do have yoga instruction for anxious kids at work is, it's good to do all of the balance and grounding and centering associated with yoga, but the kids talk about, do you know that awfully kind nature of the yoga philosophy? Do what you can do tonight, accept what your body's able to do tonight, no judging, no comparing. That's an awfully freeing experience for an anxious person. And we watch those anxious, even the boys, and you don't expect them to want to go out and do yoga, are very pleased. And I think that message is that gentle, slow, accepting nature. So part of that is what you're getting from this. So the challenge for a family is notice one pleasant event every day for the next week and write it on your calendar. You have to tell what the event was, thoughts, feelings, what you experienced when you noticed it. How did you feel in your body? How do you feel right now when you're thinking about it, right? Positive qualities, we all work so hard at trying to get our kids to recognize their positive qualities, but that we can't underestimate that. But it also involves recognizing your own and modeling some of that. So some pride in your accomplishments, some kindness to yourself. This is an example of something you can do with an older child. So we do it with the teenagers, and it's affirmations. We all know about affirmations. So they will, in their toolkits, have affirmation statements, and you can buy them online actually, but we have them make up affirmation statements that they have, and sometimes they'll carry them in their pockets, and sometimes they're in their wallets or their purses, because when something bad happens, it's important to remind yourself that you're a good person, it's not the end of the world. This is a fun one. If you have a child that tends to have kind of like panic attacks, it comes from the mindfulness training. And what you're doing is you're getting them to focus in the present, because one of the things that happens with a real surge of anxiety is your brain is spinning into disaster in the future. So think about the Bare Naked Lady song. So you say, I want you to focus on 5 things that you can see right now or imagine that you can see, because you're kind of giving the child a permission to think of something really cool that they want to see. 4 things I can hear right now or imagine I'm hearing. 3 things I can touch right now or imagine I can touch. 2 things I can smell or taste right now or imagine. And then take 1 deep, slow breath and focus on your breathing. So what that does is take them out of their head, which is really important for the anxious, because we're a group in our heads, and helps them to center, ground, remember it's okay, right? Because a panic attack makes you think the sky is falling. And you have them tell you it out loud. So this isn't a private thing. This is an interaction. So if you see it starting to happen, you're going to say, okay, let's sit down. Let's take a deep breath. And what I want you to do is tell me 5 things. And you're using your fingers. And go through. And it can really, really be helpful. The other thing is this website is fabulous, www.getselfhelp.co.uk. The British government put it together, and they've spent a lot of money on it, and it's got a lot of really good parent tips and self-help for adults. Then, calm breathing. So this is a lot like what you would do if you were coaching relaxation training to somebody. The trick is that if you breathe calmly and slowly, it will make it impossible for your body to continue to be as anxious as it is currently. Sometimes it's hard to convince kids to do this breathing when they're in the midst of a panic. I've experienced that myself, trying to help people. So it's good to practice it ahead of time so they know they can do it. But it is truly, you're sitting, your feet are on the ground, your hands are on your chair, and you get a sense of where's your bum, where's your back, where's your shoulders. You're asking them to feel the chair, basically. And then they rest their hands on their bellies and they start breathing. So they're focusing on what's their tummy doing, right? It's going in and out. They feel the muscles moving, the sinking back to the spine and back out again. What you're getting them to do is, of course, focus all of their attention off those crazy-making thoughts and back here. I'm watching my stomach. I'm breathing, and it is astounding how it works. When I used to do a lot of one-to-one work with kids, it was a nice thing to do at the end of my day. I'd be tense as all get out, and I'd be practicing this with the kids, and it really helps. Now, I've got some things here about particular kinds of anxiety disorders. I'll just quickly say that a severe form of anxiety is obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it can present in ways that parents find hard to recognize. So it can be kids that take forever to get out the door in the morning. They keep going back. Important to recognize, why are you going back? What are you doing when you go back? It can become something that prevents kids from even being able to leave the house because they've got to go through their process. What it means in the classroom is that if your teacher is telling you that the child is erasing, redoing, never getting anything done, and the teacher may be feeling concern, and nowadays teachers are much more on the ball than they were in my day, so they're more likely to be thinking not that the child's being a pain in the neck, but more that there's something else going on with anxiety. If you go to a physician, they're going to think, is it anxious perfectionism, or is it obsessive compulsive disorder, where everything has to be just so, right? And if it isn't, you have to start over. Perfectionism is a big problem for kids, huge problem for kids, and responds very well to the strategies that we're talking about. One of the things that we do with perfectionistic kids is get them to do one thing that's different than what their perfectionism would tell them to do. So our therapists will have kids practice writing things with the wrong hand. And then they've made the arrangement with the teacher, I'm turning this page in, it's going to be ridiculous, but I'm practicing giving myself permission to not be perfect, right? And that's a tricky one for parents, because we do want to give our kids praise for doing things really, really well, right? So it can drag its way along for a while before we start realizing that this is a child who's being incapacitated by the perfectionism. But if you're going backwards and you're thinking about all those coping strategies, they can really help to prevent the perfectionism from getting to that point. I know that we were going to put I have a reference list at the back of this presentation, and I think we were going to make that available to people through the email. Okay. If you go to the reference list, you're going to see there's tons of material. There's a wonderful website that the British Columbia government put out that's called Anxiety BC, and it's fabulous. So you can get tons of ideas from that, and your child might actually they can navigate through some of the exercises right online, which makes it kind of fun, but they're all listed in the reference list.